You'd think that light would be obvious, and yet that mud would be obvious, and yet that the lotus flower would be obvious, and yet that the hubless wheel would be obvious, and yet that morning dew would be obvious, and yet that the song sparrow would be obvious, and yet that life jacket would be obvious, and yet that straight jacket would be obvious, and yet that stress blanket would be obvious, and yet that apple blossom would be obvious, and yet that earthworm would be obvious, and yet the green moss on the shoreside rocks would be obvious, and yet that Wawiatanong, the big sweet whirlpool, would be obvious, and yet that Anishinaabe would be obvious, and yet that Ojibwe brothers and sisters would be obvious, and yet that Ottawa brothers and sisters would be obvious, and yet that Botawadomi brothers and sisters would be obvious, and yet that clouds in the shape of my grandmother's face laughing as the hull breaks the wave crest would be obvious, and yet that my dog's purple tongue lapping my mother's hand drooping past the wheelchair armrest would be obvious, and yet that my sister's red tricycle would be obvious, and yet that my sister on the playset platform shouting death is not pretty to the babysitter would be obvious, and yet that the flow of elm bark formation would be obvious, and yet that Jen's teary eyes would be obvious, and yet that Jen sitting lakeside firm in the eternal teaching flowing seaward in stillness and silence would be obvious, and yet that my father's clutching my sister tight to his chest after she was playing on the apartment living room carpet beside the propped-up Harley engine where it fell suddenly inches from her head to where he'd cried, "Sweetheart, oh sweetheart, why did I put that there? I'm such an idiot. Why did I do that?" And he held her so close for so long that I knew death had been in the room and I was afraid would be obvious, and yet that Jen's focused voice and presence when teaching or giving advice would be obvious, and yet that my sleeping outside Lincoln Center reading Ginsberg's Kaddish would be obvious, and yet that sunshine would be obvious, and yet that Kerouac picking watermelons would be obvious, and yet that the aperture dilating upon infinite bliss consciousness would be obvious, and yet that 12 hours in the Adoration Chapel would be obvious, and yet that St. Catherine of Siena passed out in the corner of her cell and all will be wells would be obvious, and yet that Christ in the desert would be obvious, and yet that Cousin Jeremy's loom would be obvious, and yet that my teenaged father's breathing and heart rate coming up on a dose beside the Detroit River at the point of the Garwood Mansion rear lawn midsummer would be obvious, and yet that Teresa thought I'd kissed her neck when I'd only breathed closely, but she turned to kiss me on the power of this assumption, and I kissed her back, thus unwittingly affirming this illusion would be obvious, and yet that my grandmother's red-headed duck, paperweight, and rotary dial phone, and kitchen sink television, and toy closet for timeouts in the dark, and VHS cartoons, and plastic non-firing guns, and smell of gasoline, and duck feed, and mold, and textured green Sterilite cups, and my grandfather's armpit sweat, and his non-absorbent button-ups would be obvious, and yet that the broken piano would be obvious, and yet that the sunflower would be obvious, and yet that the old cousins using the trucking business for cocaine and evaporating or inhaling it at the brittleness of the only remaining John Russman Trucking Company baseball cap would be obvious, and yet that the feel of the mint leaf in hand would be obvious, and yet the perceiving a fascinating difference in Jen's seated dancing to radio songs versus her seated dancing to her own songs heard as I lay safely on the Zabaton would be obvious, and yet that Professor Mead's mantra of "Why do you care what I write?" and dream of embracing the dark woods would be obvious, and yet that the northern flicker Buddha who picks me up by clasping my arms as would a receiving trapeze artist the sending partner after catapulting through the air and hoisting me to the roof of the world and the floor of heaven to say, "What is this?" And I say myriad spokes of invisible wheel, and "But what is this?" And my mother's stab wound scar, and "But what is this?" And love and truth, and "But what is this?" And I don't know, and good answer would be obvious, and yet that this great wind of love billowing the sheet of my skin would be obvious, and yet that the heart-rending would be a light or fire, or that the heart is an open sore, and I am the reoccurrence across time of those crying out over tear-blotted ink confessions in some ecstasy or else some agony of love that they have seen her. I have seen her, reposing under a blossoming tree of remembrance with clear love for them over many lifetimes, and that they have always found her here after weary searching and will always fall first to their knees, then to her leaf-covered lap, so that where there had been tree canopy before, and before that a sky of clouds, now there would be only her face above them, and love would be obvious, and yet that my own face would be obvious, and yet that the caterpillar and the sea would be obvious, and yet that love for all beings would be obvious, and yet. So breathe. Don't think. It is obvious.